To begin my talk, I'd like to start with a little story. A year ago, I was walking home to my house at night when I passed by another person walking in the same direction as me. Suddenly, I was filled with a strange sense of fear and started walking faster and faster as I attempted to put as much distance between me and them as possible. Of course, we passed by each other without incident, but I continued to wonder, why had I felt so much fear? It was only when I began to think of why I'd acted as I did I came across the reason. He was black, and in some part of my mind that had spawned the unconscious fear that I was in danger. Almost immediately, I had to question myself. Was I racist? The thought seemed impossible. Here I was, someone who had grown up next to two of the most diverse cities in America, someone who had always thought of themselves as someone who believed in racial equality. And I was racist? Immediately, I made excuses. That it was simply the natural response to walking next to someone at night, that I would have done the same thing to anyone else. But deep down, I knew that some part of me, some unconscious part of my mind, had automatically responded to the race of someone else, and without even thinking about it, changed how I acted. This would be my first conscious experience with implicit bias. Now, you might ask, what is implicit bias? Doctors Mazrin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald, the first to write about the topic, define it as the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. Everywhere you look, you can come across one of these biases. Men work jobs while women tend to the home. The poor are lazy while the rich are hardworking. And unfortunately, that African Americans are criminals, or that someone who is Caucasian is inherently more trustworthy. No one is free from these biases, and everyone will inevitably come to gather them over the course of their lifetime. These implicit biases come from many different sources. As we grow up, we naturally come to associate biases thanks to the words of others. The warnings of our parents, news bulletins, even our simple observations all come to influence our unconscious mind in a way that we do not perceive. Even something as simple as seeing a mustache-twirling villain in a cartoon when we are young can make the brain automatically associate mustaches with evil. They aren't something to be ashamed over, but rather simply another fact of life. But if they are just another fact of life, why are they so important? The danger of implicit bias is that it lurks in the back of your mind, without your conscious knowledge or influence. Everything you or I do, whether we know it or not, is influenced by these biases, sometimes to dangerous or harmful effects. While my personal example was thankfully only cause for embarrassment and self-reflection, in other examples, jobs, livelihoods, and even lives themselves can all be put at risk due to a bias. Perhaps one of the most infamous and sad examples of hidden bias in our society is that in our law enforcement. Racial profiling and unneeded usage of force within the police towards people of color are constants in the media, and not without reason. A study from 2015 entitled White Fear, Dehumanization, and Low Empathy, Lethal Combinations for Shooting Biases, found participants to have far lower shooting thresholds for African Americans in comparison to Asians and whites, with the dubbed white fear leading to dehumanization of African Americans, and conversely, empathy and favoritism when dealing with white criminals. In this manner, we see how an implicit bias can be truly dangerous, with lives being lost due to associations and fear. Though less fatal and quieter, hidden bias in teaching is just as common and perhaps just as dangerous in society. Mira and David Sadker and Karen R. Zittelman, in their book, Still Failing at Fairness, describe how biases of both gender and race haunt the classroom. Having studied the classroom for over 20 years, both the Sadkers and Zittelman found that boys would be encouraged and praised for speaking up in class, while for girls, they would instead encourage silence and quiet. Teachers would, when asking questions, look most often to the boys in the class and call upon them more, while often unconsciously ignoring girls. In terms of grading, they found out that on blind no-name math tests, girls would often receive higher grades than boys, while when presented with obvious boy or girl names, girls would receive lower grades than their male counterparts. such as the effect of a hidden bias that they can change how someone grades something as objective as math. But most insidious and quiet of all is internalized bias. Bias directed not against others, but to yourself and others of your social group. Internalized bias comes when a person not only comes to accept the discrimination and biases against them, but even begins to perpetuate them themselves. Perhaps some of you may have heard the infamous phrase, "Boys don't like it if you're too smart." Internalized bias can manifest anywhere and anyhow, and rarely, if ever, does it manifest positively. Women seeking an education can lag behind in their studies, blaming their gender as a reason for their failings. Boys are just better than girls at math, and thus do not apply themselves as much as a male applicant. This also comes in the workplace and even to discriminated persons in managerial position in what's known as Queen Bee syndrome. A study conducted in 2007 by Francine DeBlau and Jed DeVaro found that members of discriminated social group will often perpetuate the discrimination in the workplace, showing preference for white male subordinates and belief that said subordinates are more competent and skilled than their counterparts. This in itself provides a further uphill battle against bias, as even those most affected by it can still find themselves fervent advocates. But what can we do about it? How can we defeat our own brain, a biological process built up over millennia? The answer is surprisingly simple. You outthink it. In their book, Blind Spot, the aforementioned authors Greenwald and Banaji put forth that active awareness is the most effective tool against implicit bias. By becoming aware of your own implicit biases, by knowing your unconscious brain will try to lead you, you can catch yourself and think, would I say that to a woman? Would I act like that to a white man? It may take a second at first, but as you catch yourself, rethink, and reorient, that too will become part of the unconscious process, helping to nullify your own inner bias. It is to this end that researchers have created the Implicit Association Test, also known as the IAT, hoping to simultaneously study and make test takers aware of their own implicit biases. The IAT puts forth a series of tests on associations of faces of a certain color or sex with that of concepts. Whether you associate the face of a person of color or that of a white person more with weapons or love, or that of a woman with home rather than office. Through these tests, the test taker, now aware of their own biases, can strive to mend their own biases, being able to attack them head on. More and more, as we as a society become collectively aware of our own biases, we have doubled our efforts to fight them at every turn. Implicit bias training, meant to make employees aware of their own hidden biases, is an increasingly common sight in the workplace, while teachers and applicant reviewers increasingly turn to blind applications or test taking, seeking to remove potentially altering factors. While we may never truly live in a society without bias, by becoming aware, by taking the steps to prevent it, and by staying vigilant, we can together create a society more open, free, and equal to all of its inhabitants. Thank you for your time.